In this video, we're going to talk about dividing complex numbers. So before we can do that, we have to talk a little bit about complex conjugates. So remember, a conjugate means they're the exact same terms. So I see an A, BI, BI, but then the signs in the middle are opposite. So one's positive and one's negative. When we multiply those together, we should get a difference of squares, but because of that I squared, it becomes a sum of squares. Okay, and those sum of squares are real numbers, so I'm going to end up with a real number and no complex number here, no I. And we're going to use these to divide complex numbers. For example, it says divide, right, in the form A plus BI. Okay, so even though it says divide, and that's kind of misleading, we actually are trying to get rid of the I in the denominator. Essentially rationalizing like we did with the radicals, but now with I. So to get rid of that I in the denominator, we're going to multiply by its conjugate. The conjugate of 1 minus I would be 1 plus I. Whatever I do in the denominator, I have to do the exact same thing in the numerator to keep it equivalent. So notice in the numerator, I have something I need to box out or FOIL. So 2 plus I on one side and 1 plus I on the other side. 2 times 1 is 2. 2 times I is 2I. 1 times I is I. And I times I is I squared. So in the numerator here, I have 2 plus 2I plus 1I would be 3I. And I squared is negative 1. And then I'm going to simplify that in a minute. In the denominator, until you're comfortable getting that sum of squares when you multiply it out, go ahead and FOIL or box it out. So I'm multiplying 1 minus I and 1 plus I. 1 times 1 is 1. 1 times I is I. 1 times a negative I is negative I. And negative I times I would be negative I squared. Like terms, I have I minus I. That's 0. The middle term should always drop out. Then I'm left with 1 minus I squared. But I squared itself is negative 1. And don't lose this negative we already had. We already had a subtraction here. And now we're adding a negative from I squared. So 1 minus a negative 1 becomes 1 plus 1, which is 2. And then I need to simplify again that 2 plus a negative 1 in the numerator. 2 plus negative 1 is positive 1. So some textbooks have you leave it like that, but they specifically asked us to write it in the form A plus BI. So I'm going to take one step further and divide that 2. So 1 divided by 2 is just 1/2. And 3I divided by 2 will be 3/2 I. So now that's in the form A plus BI, where A is 1/2 and B is 3/2. Okay? Alright, part B here. So technically, 3I is the same thing as 0 plus 3I, right? 0 plus anything is itself. So 0 is our whole number, and 3I is that imaginary part. The conjugate of that would be 0 minus 3I. So if you see something like this on your homework and it asks for what's the conjugate is negative 3I, right? So it's the same exact terms. We just add or do the opposite sign. So if it's positive 3I, now it's negative 3I. And the real number part is 0, so we don't need to write it. So technically that's the conjugate. But my tip to you is if you only have one term in the denominator, so I only have 3I, there's no plus or minus anything else, I don't have to multiply by negative 3I. I'm going to be multiplying by that negative 3 in the numerator and denominator, and then it's going to divide out again. So I don't even need to add that. I'm just going to multiply by I. Because what I need is that I squared to get rid of the complex part, and because I squared is -1, which is a real number. So if you, again, this only works if you have one term in the denominator. If you have two terms, you have to use the conjugates. But in this case, I just have the one term, so I'm just going to multiply by I. Numerator and denominator, all of it. In the numerator, I'm going to distribute. I'll have 7 times I, and -4i times I would be -4i squared. Don't lose that I times I. In the denominator, I'll have 3i times I, which is 3i squared. I'm going to rewrite all those I squareds. That's 4 times -1, and 3 times -1. Now I've got 7i plus 4 over a -3. Again, it asks for our answer in a plus bi form. So a is the constant, b is the coefficient to the I term. So I need to rearrange this a little bit. If it helps you, you could put 4 plus 7i first, just to make sure it's in that a plus bi form. But then I need to actually separate those. So 4 divided by -3 would be -4/3. 7i divided by -3 would be -7/3 I. So again, real number plus or minus the imaginary part. A in this case would be -4/3. B would be -7/3. Okay? And there you have it. So two terms multiplied by conjugates. One term you can just multiply by I.